The tragedy of the Titanic is a story most of us know well. The luxury liner deemed unsinkable, the iceberg in the North Atlantic, and the devastating loss of over 500 souls on that fateful night of April 14, 1912. But what if the disaster wasn't simply bad luck or a chance encounter with an iceberg? What if a complex web of decisions, oversights, and circumstances had already sealed the Titanic's fate long before it struck that infamous chunk of ice? Today, we're diving deep into the untold story of how multiple factors converged to doom the Titanic before it ever left port. When we examine historical disasters, hindsight often reveals a chain of events rather than a single catastrophic moment. The Titanic's story is no different. While the collision with the iceberg was the immediate cause of sinking, a series of decisions and circumstances created the perfect storm for disaster. Some of these factors were technical, some were human, and some were simply the product of the era's hubris and competitive spirit in the golden age of ocean liners. Let's start with perhaps the most alarming revelation: the fire that burned silently in the bowels of the ship before it even set sail. In 2017, journalist Sinan Molani presented compelling evidence that a coal bunker fire had been raging for weeks before the Titanic departed. This wasn't just a minor incident. It was a serious blaze that began during the ship's fitting out period in Belfast. According to accounts from fireman Jay Dilley and several other crew members who later testified, the fire in coal bunker number 6 had been burning since January 1912, approximately 3 weeks before the maiden voyage. What makes this particularly significant is the location of the fire. Coal bunker number 6 was adjacent to the hull area that would later make contact with the iceberg. Engineers at the time knew that such intense heat, which could reach over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, could seriously compromise the structural integrity of the ship's steel. The metallurgy of the early 20th century produced steel that became brittle when exposed to extreme temperature fluctuations, exactly what happened when the superheated hull plates finally made contact with the freezing North Atlantic waters. The fire was so severe that it had warped and weakened the bulkhead separating the boiler rooms. When the iceberg struck, this compromised section failed much faster than it should have. Fireman Charles Hendrickson testified at the British inquiry that the bulkhead was damaged. The bulkhead wasn't damaged, but the side of the bunker was damaged. In my opinion, the fire must have weakened the bulkhead. Yet, this critical information was largely downplayed at the inquiries following the disaster. Why would White Star Line allow a ship to sail with such a dangerous situation? The answer likely lies in economics and reputation. The Titanic represented an enormous investment, approximately $7.5 million in 1912, equivalent to over $200 million today. Delays would have been catastrophically expensive, and the company was under immense pressure to maintain its schedule and reputation in the competitive transatlantic market. The Olympic Titanic's sister ship had already experienced setbacks and collisions, putting additional pressure on the White Star Line to deliver a successful maiden voyage for the Titanic. But the fire wasn't the only pre-existing condition that contributed to the disaster. The very materials used to construct the ship played a crucial role. The Titanic's hull was built using low-grade iron rivets rather than steel rivets in many sections, a decision made to cut costs and speed up construction. Metallurgical analysis of recovered rivets shows they contained high levels of slag, making them brittle, especially in cold temperatures. When the iceberg struck, instead of bending, these rivets likely popped out, allowing seams to open much more rapidly than they should have. Dr. Tim Folke and Jennifer Hooper McCarty, who analyzed recovered rivets, found that the heads of many rivets had separated completely from their shanks, evidence of catastrophic failure at the moment of impact. This rivet quality issue affected approximately 60% of the rivets used in the bow and stern sections, precisely where the iceberg made contact. The central section of the ship, where more expensive steel rivets were used, remained largely intact until the final breakup of the vessel. Then there's the curious case of the missing binoculars. In a decision that seems almost trivially small, but had enormous consequences, Second Officer David Blair was reassigned just before the Titanic's departure. In the shuffle of personnel, he inadvertently took with him the key to the crow's nest locker, containing the binoculars meant for the lookouts. As a result, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, the men on duty when the iceberg was spotted, had to rely solely on their naked eyes. During the subsequent inquiry, Fleet was asked if binoculars would have helped spot the iceberg sooner. His response was chilling in its simplicity. "We could have seen it a bit sooner." When asked how much sooner, he replied, "Enough to get out of the way." Those few critical minutes might have been all that was needed to avoid the collision entirely. The binoculars remained locked away for the entire journey, a small oversight with devastating consequences. Adding to these technical issues was the ship's inexperienced crew. While Captain Edward Smith was highly regarded, having commanded numerous White Star vessels, he had minimal experience with a ship of the Titanic's unprecedented size. The maiden voyage was also the first time the crew had worked together as a unit, with many having joined just before departure. Emergency drills were inadequate, and the crew was unfamiliar with the exact locations of lifeboats and safety equipment. This inexperience manifested in the chaotic evacuation, where lifeboats were launched partially filled, some carrying as few as 12 passengers, despite having a capacity for 65. The lack of proper training and coordination directly contributed to the high death toll, even after the ship had struck the iceberg. There's also compelling evidence that the Titanic was traveling too fast for the conditions. 6 iceberg warnings had been received throughout the day of the disaster, yet the ship maintained a speed of 22 knots, nearly maximum speed, as it entered the ice field. This was standard practice at the time. Shipping companies believed that speed through potential ice areas was safer than lingering in dangerous waters. Captain Smith, with decades of experience crossing the Atlantic, had never experienced a major accident and likely believed the conventional wisdom that the ship could turn quickly enough to avoid any visible obstacles. What's more, White Star Line's chairman, J. Bruce Ismay, was aboard the ship and had reportedly expressed interest in arriving in New York ahead of schedule to generate positive publicity. While Ismay denied pressuring Captain Smith to maintain speed, several survivors reported overhearing conversations suggesting Ismay's desire for a record-breaking crossing. The competitive pressure to outshine Cunard's ships, the Lusitania and Mauretania, which held the speed records for Atlantic crossings, may have influenced operational decisions. The lifeboats, or rather, the insufficient number of them, represent another pre-existing condition that sealed the fate of many passengers before they ever boarded. The Titanic carried only 20 lifeboats with a total capacity of 1,178 people, despite having over 2,200 passengers and crew on board. This wasn't an oversight, but a deliberate decision based on outdated regulations and aesthetic considerations. The British Board of Trade regulations at the time required ships over 10,000 tons to carry 16 lifeboats. The problem? These regulations had been written in 1894 when the largest ships were around 10,000 tons. The Titanic, at over 46,000 tons, was more than 4 times larger, yet the regulations hadn't been updated. Legally, the Titanic exceeded the minimum requirement by carrying 20 lifeboats instead of 16. White Star Line officials had initially planned for 48 lifeboats, but reduced the number partly due to concerns that too many boats would make the deck appear cluttered and less luxurious. The emphasis on aesthetics and luxury over safety reflected the prevailing attitude of the time, that technology had conquered nature, and the ship was, for all practical purposes, unsinkable. This marketing narrative of the unsinkable ship created a dangerous level of overconfidence. Although White Star Line never officially advertised the Titanic as unsinkable before the disaster, the term appeared in promotional materials and industry journals. A 1910 issue of Shipbuilder magazine described the Olympic-class vessels, including the Titanic, as practically unsinkable. This perception influenced decisions at every level, from the number of lifeboats to the casual response to ice warnings. The ship's watertight compartment design, while innovative, contained a critical flaw that predated the voyage. The Titanic had 16 watertight compartments separated by bulkheads, but these walls didn't extend all the way to the top decks. Instead, they reached only a few decks above the waterline. The designers calculated that no foreseeable accident would flood more than 4 compartments, and the ship could remain afloat with up to 4 compartments flooded. However, the iceberg damaged at least 5 compartments. Once water filled a compartment to the top of its bulkhead, it spilled over into the next compartment, like water flowing over a series of dams. This design limitation, combined with the damaged rivets that allowed water to enter more rapidly, created a situation where sinking was inevitable once the initial damage occurred. Let's not forget about the weather conditions that preceded the disaster. The winter of 1911 to 1912 had been unusually mild, causing more icebergs than normal to break away from Greenland's glaciers. Additionally, on January 4, 1912, the moon made its closest approach to Earth in 1,400 years, creating exceptionally high tides that may have helped dislodge icebergs and move them into the shipping lanes. A mild winter, followed by abnormally high tides, created an environment where the North Atlantic contained more ice hazards than usual, a condition that existed months before the Titanic's launch. There's also the strange case of the Titanic's near collision at the start of its journey. As the massive ship departed Southampton, the suction created by its hull caused the moored SS New York to break free from its moorings. The New York drifted toward the Titanic, coming within just a few feet of collision before tugboats intervened. Some witnesses later described this as an ill omen, a warning unheeded. Captain Smith ordered full astern on the port engine to reduce the suction effect, narrowly avoiding what would have been an embarrassing and potentially journey-ending collision before the Titanic had even properly begun its maiden voyage. Even communication technology played a role in sealing the Titanic's fate. While the ship had wireless telegraph technology, cutting edge for its time, the system was primarily used for passenger messages rather than safety communications. The Marconi operators were employed by the Marconi Company, not White Star Line, and their primary responsibility was handling passenger telegrams, which generated revenue. Safety messages, including ice warnings, were secondary. On the night of the disaster, the Californian, another ship in the vicinity, attempted to warn the Titanic about ice in the area. The Titanic's wireless operator, Jack Phillips, was busy clearing a backlog of passenger messages to Cape Race, Newfoundland, and responded to the Californian's warning with, shut up, I am busy. I am working Cape Race." Shortly afterward, the Californian's wireless operator turned off his equipment and went to bed. When the Titanic struck the iceberg less than an hour later, the Californian's wireless was silent, and its officers, though they saw the Titanic's distress rockets, failed to respond adequately. This communication breakdown was not merely bad luck, but a result of systemic priorities that placed passenger convenience and commercial interests above safety concerns, a decision made long before the ship sailed. Another overlooked factor is the inadequate testing of the ship. Due to delays in construction and the pressure to launch on schedule, sea trials for the Titanic lasted only about 12 hours, insufficient for a vessel of its unprecedented size and complexity. Modern ships undergo days or weeks of sea trials to identify and address any issues. The abbreviated testing meant that the crew had minimal opportunity to familiarize themselves with the ship's handling characteristics, emergency procedures, or quirks that might become apparent during operation. Finally, there's the matter of the lookouts and the visibility conditions. The night of April 14 was unusually clear and calm, with no moon and a flat sea. While this might seem advantageous for spotting obstacles, experienced sailors know that such conditions make it extremely difficult to spot icebergs. Without waves breaking at the base of an iceberg, and with no moonlight to create reflections, icebergs become nearly invisible until they're very close. Modern studies have shown that dark icebergs against a dark sky on a calm sea create what mariners call black water, almost impossible to detect visually until it's too late. The Titanic's lookouts, stationed in the crow's nest 29 meters above the water, were searching for something that the conditions made nearly impossible to see. Add to this the lack of binoculars, and the deck was stacked against them before they ever took their posts. So, was the Titanic's fate sealed before it set sail? The evidence strongly suggests that a perfect storm of factors, some technical, some human, some natural, converged to doom the ship. From compromised steel weakened by fire and poor quality rivets to insufficient lifeboats, inadequate training, excessive speed, outdated regulations, communication failures, and unprecedented natural conditions, each element contributed to the tragedy. The disaster led to significant maritime reforms. International ice patrols were established. Regulations mandated enough lifeboats for all passengers and crew. 24-hour radio watches became mandatory on passenger ships, and regular lifeboat drills were required. In many ways, modern maritime safety was born from the lessons of the Titanic's tragedy. The Titanic continues to fascinate us, not just because of the scale of the tragedy or the luxury of the ship, but because it represents a perfect case study in how disasters rarely have a single cause. They are instead the result of cascading failures, each seemingly manageable on its own, but catastrophic when combined. The ship that couldn't sink was compromised by a series of decisions, oversights, and circumstances long before it encountered that fateful iceberg in the North Atlantic. As we reflect on this tragedy over a century later, perhaps the most important lesson is not about shipbuilding techniques or navigation practices, but about hubris, the danger of believing that technology has made us invulnerable to the forces of nature. The Titanic story reminds us that no matter how advanced our technology becomes, respect for natural forces and a commitment to safety must always take precedence over speed, luxury, and convenience. The seeds of disaster were sown long before the Titanic's maiden voyage, a sobering reminder that in complex systems, small decisions can have enormous consequences.